We're at the top of DAF Kuf Aleph Amud Aleph at the Mishnah. And some of the things that the Mishnah and the Gemara will be describing for us are a little bit hard to envision, just because, construction is very different in the Talmudic period from what it is today, but we'll try our best to try and capture the image in our minds. Hadelis Shabamuktzah, if you have a door that is used for a storage shed, usually that's a storage shed that's behind your house, and because it's not built with the same sturdiness as a living facility, you don't normally attach a real door to the opening of the shed. You just basically take a plank of wood or something else that looks like a door, but it's not attached with a hinge to the shed. And v'chadokim shebepirtza. Another example would be is that if you have bundles of thistles that you use to stuff into a hole in the wall, to plug up the breach, umachatzalos, and reed mats. These are also things that you would use as a cover for a hole or a doorway. Ein noelin bahen. So on Shabbos we don't permit you to put these things in front of the door to seal it off. And the reason is because it's like an act of construction, because since these things are not permanently affixed to the structure, it's like you're adding to the structure on Shabbos. Ela im kain gevohim min haaretz. The only exception is if they are elevated from the ground. The way that Rashi explains is cheshehu magbia al hamashkof. I'm sorry. No. Rashi doesn't base it. Rashi just says that if they're dragged on the ground, then it's not okay. They have to be elevated off the ground. If they're elevated off the ground, so then it's okay. Now, what does elevated off the ground mean exactly? It could be that it's suspended by something that's holding it in place, holding it off the ground, but it's not really clear from the Mishnah. Let's take a look at the Gemara now. Uraminhu. We raise a contradiction. Deles hanigreres umachatzeles hanigreres v'kan kan hanigrar. If you have a door that schleps, that drags on the ground, meaning that it's not really attached to anything, you have to drag it in order to affix it to the doorway. And the same thing is with a mat of reeds, and the same thing is with some kind of jug that it was not really a jug, but it was some kind of canister.
Can is like for tea, usually.
Yeah, it could be, but it's
your plow handle.
Well, it's a canister. That's usually what the word kan means, but it's part of the apparatus of a plow, is what Rashi explains. And people would also use that as a way of sealing off a door. So bisman shekeshurim utluyim nolin bahen b'Shabbos vein sarach lomer biyom tov. Only when they are tied to the door, the rest of the frame, the rest of the structure, and they are tluyin, they are suspended, so that they're not dangling on the ground, only then can you add them or affix them to your structure on Shabbos, and certainly on Yontif. So the question that the Gemara is asking over here is that Rashi explains, Alma ataliyahu dekapid aval agevohi min haaretz lo chayish. The Rashi explains that what the Gemara's question is that they have to be connected in some way to the door, but that they have to be elevated off the ground. That doesn't seem to be something that the Brisa cares about. That it has to be attached and it has to be something that's not schlepping on the ground, that's one thing. But that it has to be elevated off the ground, that's not something that the Brisa requires. So the Gemara says, Amar Abaye b'sheyesh lahem tzir. So Abaye says that when the Brisa says that they don't have to be elevated off the ground, it's talking about where these items have a hinge. Now what we mean by a hinge is that by a door you see that it's clearly connected to the structure. That's where we say that as long as it has that kind of hinge that shows that it's part of the structure, you don't need it to be elevated off the ground. Even if it slides across the floor when you open and close, then it's acceptable. But the Mishnah is talking about where there is no hinge that connects it to the structure, and as a result, in order to demonstrate that you're not creating a new addition, it has to be in some way suspended above the ground in order for us to allow you to affix this. Rava Amar b'shahaya lahen sir. Rabbi says that even if presently the door is not hinged to the door frame, but at least it was at some time hinged to the door frame, which means that you can see, hey, this door belongs with this door frame. So then we also allow you to affix it on Shabbos as long as it's currently connected or tethered in some way. But if there was never a hinge at all, there's no recognizable sign that this object that you want to use to seal off the doorway is in some way related to the structure, so then it needs to be elevated off the ground. And again, elevated off the ground, it's not clear from the Gemara how you're elevating it. In some way it's being suspended. So it's not really clear to me, at least. I couldn't...
maybe it hangs from the top.
Maybe it's hanging from the top. I don't know how else to explain it.
About making a charitz, like you can't pull a chair in the sand.
I guess you have to say it's not a psik reisha, just like we saw by the chair. So meisvei. So let's raise a question. Deles hanigreres umachatzeles hanigreres v'kankan hanigrar bisman shekershurin uteluyin ugevohim in haaretz afilu malonim anoalin bahem v'im lav eino alin bahem. So this brisa requires everything. It requires that it has to be connected or attached in some way, and it requires that it has to be elevated off the ground. Even if it's elevated off the ground just a hair's breadth, then that's sufficient. So what the brisa is basically saying is that you need both. And what we've been saying is that all along you need either or. You need it either to be elevated or suspended off the ground, or you need it to be attached in some way. But to say that you need to have both, that we've never seen. So Abaya mitaretz l'taimei v'Rava mitaretz l'taimei. Abaya mitaretz l'taimei o sheyesh lahen sir o shegavon min haaretz. That Abaya says you can have one of two things. Either it has a hinge, it's hinged to the door frame, in which case it demonstrates that it's part of the structure, and then it doesn't have to be elevated off the ground. Or if it doesn't have a hinge, then it has to be elevated off the ground in order to show that it's part of the structure. Rava mitaretz l'taimei kishahayu lahen sir o shegavon min haaretz. Rava answers and says that, again, according to his reasoning, that it doesn't mamish have to be hinged presently, but as long as there is hinges that are recognizable, that demonstrate that this door, it belongs as part of this structure, so then that's sufficient, even if it's not elevated off the ground. Or if it doesn't have that hinge visible, then it has to be elevated off the ground. But the bottom line is, the Gemara is saying, is that either or is acceptable. Okay, fine. Tanu Rabbanan. Soche kotzim v'chavilan shehiskinim lepirtza shebechatzer. These are, again, what we're talking about are bundles of thorns and thistles, and you had set these things aside to use to stuff up holes that are in the wall in your chatzir. Bisman shekeshurim utuluyim nolin bahen b'Shabbos. When they are tied and attached or tethered to your wall, so then you're allowed to use them as your hole stuffer. Ve'ein sarach lomer b'yamtiv, and then surely you can do that on yamtiv as well. So Tani Reb Chia, Deles almana hanigreres eino alin ba. A widow door that schleps on the ground cannot be used to seal off a doorway on Shabbos. Now, what does this mean, a deles almana, a widow door? Obviously, it's
Single door.
It's a single, it doesn't say a bachelor door, it says a widow door, which implies that it seems like it's something that is by alone. It's a standalone door that's not really connected to anything. So, Hechi dami deles almana, ika da amri de chad shifa, ve'ika da amri de lesle gashma. So there are two explanations. Some say that this door has no recognizable signs of being constructed as a door, because it's one solid piece of wood. Normally, when you want to build a door, you build pieces of wood, and you connect them together in some way, right, to create the door. But here it's just one solid plank of wood, so that doesn't necessarily indicate. It could be just a piece of wood that's for construction purposes. There's no indication inherent in this wood that it's meant as a door. Others explain that it is made of different pieces of wood, but they're not held together by iron braces, which is normally how you construct a door. You have to brace the wood together with some kind of iron reinforcement, and this doesn't have it. So Amar Rav Yehuda, so basically the reason why you can't do this is because there's no recognizable sign that it's a door, and it's not suspended off the ground, and as a result it doesn't look like a real door, and therefore it's considered to be adding to the structure on Shabbos. Amar Rav Yehuda, Hai Medurta Mimala Lamata Shari Mimata Lamala Asir. So basically, this is a sugya that's more prevalent in Maseches Beitza. But basically what the Gemara is saying is that in the same vein as the discussion of Bona, that we're talking about adding something that doesn't look like a door to a structure, in the same way the rabbis were strict, and they said that when you want to create something structural on Shabbos or Yantif, even though it's mutter to do it, for sure midiraisa, because it's not a real structure, but we want you to do it with a shinoi, with a change, because it looks like you're building something. So an example of this is that if you're building a bonfire on Yantif, for example, you're allowed to build a bonfire on Yantif, but you have to carefully stack different grades of wood, and therefore they said it looks like you're building something, so therefore in order to do it with a shinoi, take the top pieces of firewood and hold them up in midair, and then have your friend bring the bottom pieces, and then drop the top pieces on the bottom pieces. In other words, don't build it from the bottom up, build it from the top down. And then the same thing they said is v'chein beyasa, v'chein kidra, v'chein purya, v'chein chavisa. The same thing is true if, today we do a weenie roast. Back then they did an egg roast. So if you want to do an egg roast on Yantif and pile your eggs on top of a bonfire, hold the eggs first and then build the firewood down below them second. And v'chein kidron, the same thing with a pot. If you wanted to do a makeshift tripod to cook something under with a fire under it, hold the pot there first and then assemble the two barrels or the two props that you're going to hold up the pot with. V'chein purya, the same thing as with a bed. Typically, the bed that we're talking about is some kind of a detachable bed, which can be assembled and disassembled on Shabbos and Yantiv. However, you have to do it with a shinoi. So we're talking about a bed where the mattress is made out of a leather, made out of just a leather. What's the word I'm looking for?
Strap.
Not strap, but just like a solid piece of leather. A solid piece of leather that has hooks on all around it, and you hook the hooks to the bed frame. And so, yeah, exactly, sort of like a hammock, but with a piece of leather. And so what you would do is normally you'd put down the bed frame and then you'd take the leather and hook it to the bed frame. Here, what you should do is you should hold the leather in place and have a friend bring the bed frame and put it underneath, and then hook it to the bed frame that way. And then finally, v'chein chavisa, when you want to stack your barrels of goods in your cellar, in the same way, don't stack them in the normative fashion from bottom up. Do it from top bottom, which means hold up the top barrel and have your friend bring the bottom barrel beneath it.
That's a locha?
What?
That's a locha for Shabbos?
Well, I'm not sure the applications. I know it's codified in Shulchan Aruch, but I'm not sure exactly how we apply it bisman hazeh. There are many different scenarios. Amrlei hahut tzeduki l'Rebbi Yeshua ben Chananya. So now a little bit of a garata. So there was a tzeduki, and some say that he was a min, an early Christian. Says to Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, chad ka'a. He says, you people are thorns. Because we were talking about thorns or thistles up until now. Dichsiv b'chu, because it says in the book of Micha, tovam kechedek, that the best Jews are like thorns. So Amrlei shatya shvil l'seifei dekra. So he said, foolish one, you didn't look at the next part of the pasuk. It says that right afterwards, dichsiv, yashar mimesucha. He says that the best Jews are like a sukkah, are like a canopy that is a protective canopy. So ve'elamai toivim kechedek. So then what does the first part mean when it says the best of them are like thorns? Keshem shechadakim halalu meginim al hapirtza, kach tovim shabanu meginim aleinu. That just like you can have a bundle of thorns that you can use as a stuffer for a wall to repair the breaches, so too the great tzaddikim of Klal Yisrael protect Klal Yisrael and repair the breaches. Davar acher, another explanation is tovam kechedek shemahadkim es harishaim, and some have the girsa es umos ha'olam legehenim. That the best Jews are like thorns because what do? They act as thorns for the wicked of the other nations, because we we raise the bar for the rest of the world. That's why one of the reasons for anti-Semitism is that we make the rest of the world look bad because of our compassion and our humanity and so forth. So that's why we act as a thorn for them. Shenamar, kumi, this is also in Micha, kumi vadoshi bas Tzion. Come and trample, O daughter of Zion. Ki karnech ishim barzel. Or rather, asim barzel, because your horns I shall make as iron. Uparsosaya chasim nechusha, and your hoofs I will make like copper. v'hadikos amim rabim, and you shall trample many nations, etc. Okay, let's go on to the next Mishnah. Lo yamud adam b'rshus hayachid v'yiftach b'rshus harabim v'yiftach b'rshus hayachid eli imkein asa mechitza gavo asar tfachim divrei Reb Meir. Now we saw this 2 days ago, so let me just see if you can remember this. We had seen a Mishnah that the Chachamim are cited as saying that it is okay if you're standing in Rishus HaYachid and there's an object in the Rishus HaRabim, you're allowed to stick out your hand into Rishus HaRabim and move the object less than Daled Amos is okay. And we're not worried that you're going to pick it up and bring it into Rishus HaYachid. Okay, that's what we had seen the Chachamim. Here we see that Reb Meir disagrees with that, and Reb Meir says you're not allowed to stand in a Rishus HaYachid, go stick out your hand into Rishus HaRabim where there's a door and use a key to open the door. Why? Because we're scared that you're going to bring the key back towards you into the Rishus HaYachid. So it's mamish, a direct machlokas to what we saw in the previous Mishnah according to the Chachamim. And the only way that you would be allowed to, and in the opposite case, you cannot stand in a Rishus HaRabim when the door is in a Rishus HaYachid and the key is in a Rishus HaYachid. Take the key to unlock the door because we're scared that you're going to pull the key back towards you into Rishus HaRabim. The only way that you can do this is if you create a little partition all around you to cordon yourself off from the rest of the Rishus HaRabim and to make your own little makeshift Rishus HaYachid in front of the door, then will allow you to open the door that way. That's according to Reb Meir. So Amrlo, so the rabbi said back to him, Reb Meir, we disagree. Ma'isa b'shuk shel patomim shahaya b'Yerushalayim shahayu no'olinu manichin es ha'mafteach b'chalon shel gabi ha'pesach. And they said to him, they said, Rabbi Meir, we know very well of a story of where there was a marketplace of butchers in Yerushalayim. It was a public thoroughfare where there was a doorway that was opened up to the Rishus HaRabim that was from a Rishus HaYachid, and there was a window, or sort of like a cubby, above the doorway, and that's where the key rested. And the rabbis permitted a person to be standing in the Rishus HaRabim, grabbing the key, and then lowering it into the keyhole to open the door, which was in a Rishus HaYachid. So you see that such activity is permitted. And Rabbi Yossi Omer Shuk Shel Tzamorim Hava. Rabbi Yossi agrees with the Chachamim's objection, but he just wants to correct the details of the story. It wasn't a shuk of butchers, it was a shuk of wool manufacturers. Okay? But either way, he just wants to make sure you get the story straight. But they both disagree with Rabbi Meir. So the Gemara now says, V'Rabbanan Amar Rabbi Meir Rishus HaRabim Mahadru Inhu Karmelis. The Gemara is asking a question according to the Chachamim. The only time that Rabbi Meir says that there's a prohibition is when your hand is going from a Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim or vice versa. So then why are they bringing an objection from a case where there's no real Rishus HaRabim, but at the most there's a Carmelis? That you're going from a Carmelis to a Rishus HaYachid, not from a Rishus HaRabim to a Rishus HaYachid. And how do I know? Because all of Yerushalayim has a din of a Carmelis, as I'm about to demonstrate. The Amar Rabba Bar Barchana Amar Rabbi Yochanan Yerushalayim ilmolei dal soseha nin olos balayla chayavin aleha mishum Rishus HaRabim. That were it not for the fact that Jerusalem's doors seal off every evening, it has enough of a population that passes by it daily for it to be considered to be a Rishus HaRabim. What do you see from that statement? That currently Yerushalayim is a Carmelis because they seal off the doors every night. So maybe Rabbi Meir can agree with what the Chachamim are saying. You can't bring a proof against Rabbi Meir in a situation that's not a real Rishus HaRabim. So Amar Rav Papa kan kodem shenifritzu ba'pratzos kan la'achar shenifritzu ba'pratzos. Rav Papa says you're not learning history. The Mishnah is talking about a time when Jerusalem was not a Carmelis. There was a period in history, I guess maybe during a time when the city was about to be destroyed, when there were breaches that formed in the walls of the city, and it was no longer sealed off at night on all sides to make it into a Carmelis. And that's what the Chachamim were talking about, that despite the fact that at that point in history Jerusalem had the status of a Rishus HaRabim, the rabbi still permitted to stick out your hand into the Rishus HaYachid to unlock and lock the door. So Rava says, no, that's not the answer. I'll give you a different answer. That what's really going on in the Mishnah is that there's a subtext of the Mishnah which is as follows. Seifa asar in l'shari gina v'hachi ka'amar. That really Rabbi Meir did not just mean to address the case of a Rishus HaRabim to Rishus HaYachid, but also a case of where you have a garden, and the garden opens up to Rishus HaRabim. And that's a situation where it's not going from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim, but it's going from a Carmelist to Rishus HaRabim, where at most there would only be a rabbinic prohibition of transferal, and nevertheless Rabbi Meir still prohibits you to stick your hand from one domain to the other. V'hachi ka'amar, v'chein lo yamod b'Rishus HaYachid v'yiftach b'Carmelis v'yiftach b'Rishus HaYachid. And what Rabbi Meir was saying is that, and here I actually should correct myself, it's not a Carmelist to Rishus HaRabim, but rather a Rishus HaYachid to a Carmelist. Rabbi Meir says that when you have a door that opens from a Carmelist to Rishus HaYachid, he says that too is prohibited, to stick your hand from the Carmelist to the Rishus HaYachid and grab the key and so forth. So you see that but basically what Rava is saying is that there's a subtext that's not explicit in the Mishnah, but that's what Rabbi Meir comes to prohibit. And on that, unless you make a wall around your Carmelis of 10 tfachim to make it into a Rishus HaYachid, and Divrei Reb Meir, and Amrulo, Ma'isa b'shuk shel patomim, shahya b'Yerushalayim, shayunolin u'menichin es ha'mafteach b'chalon shel gabei ha'pesach, and Rabbi Yossi Omer, shuk shel tzamorim haya. And that's where you have the Chachamim raise the objection and say that no, in Yerushalayim, which was a Carmelist to a Rishus HaYachid, the rabbis permitted that kind of activity, and Rabbi Yossi just says it wasn't a butcher shuk, it was a wool manufacturing shuk. But in any event, so that's the way Rav explains it, and it turns out that what the Gemara is maintaining at this point, and this is very important just to hold in your head, the Gemara is maintaining at this point that not only does Rabbi Meir prohibit sticking your hand from a Rishus HaRabim to Rishus HaYachid and vice versa, but he also prohibits sticking your hand from a Carmelist to Rishus HaYachid or from a Carmelist to Rishus HaRabim and manipulating items in that other domain. Okay? It seems like it's Gzeira l'Gzeira. Sometimes the rabbis raise that objection and sometimes they say Kula Chada Gezerei. But we'll have to see. The Gemara is going to actually tell us that Rabbi Meir later retracts this. So hold on just a few more minutes. Tanu Rabbanan. So now the Brisa says, Pesach Sharei Gina. Pische rather Sharei Gina. Now here we're talking about a garden which is a Carmelis, and here the scenario is slightly different. Here the garden opens up to a Rishus HaRabim. Instead of the garden in the previous case opening to a Rishus HaYachid, here you have a wall that divides between someone's private garden, which is going to be deemed as a Carmelis, and it opens up into a Rishus HaRabim. Now, Bisman sheyesh lehen beishar mibifnim poseach v'nol mibifnim, mibachutz poseach v'nol mibachutz. Now, here what the Gemara is describing is a structure that used to be built in front of a door. You would build this structure in front of a door. It was almost like a fort, so that if you came in from the outside, you would open the door, and instead of going straight into your garden, you would come into an enclosed structure. Maybe it was like a place to hang your umbrella, to take off your boots. I'm not sure exactly what it was for, but that's what it was. Basically a guard post, and sometimes it was behind the door, and sometimes it was in front of the door, meaning sometimes it was in the Gina, in the Carmelis, and sometimes it was in front of the door in the Rishus HaRabim. So basically now what the Gemara is also describing is a door itself where the lock of the door has the status, presumably, of a Rishus HaYachid. And it's important to realize that the lock box, it's not just that there was a lock apparatus built into the door. A lot of times there was like a lock box that was attached to the door that was quite large, and you would leave the key on top of the lock box that was attached to the door. You'd pull it off, and then you'd stick the key into the lock itself and open it. And they viewed the lockbox as a Rishus HaYachid because it was higher than 10 tfachim off the ground, and it was 4 by 4 tfachim in horizontal dimensions. So the way that it works is that if you have one of these fort-like enclosures, if the fort-like enclosure is on the inside, and on the Gina side, So then you're allowed to lock and unlock the door from the Gina side because you'll be standing in a Rishus HaYachid when you wish to lock and unlock the door. If the fort-like structure, this Beis Sha'ar, is on the outside going in from the Rishus HaRabim, then you can only lock and unlock the door from the outside because there the key, you'll be handling the key from a Rishus HaYachid as well. Mikanu mikan posech v'noel kan v'kan. So if you have a fort-like structure on both sides of the door, so then you're allowed to lock and unlock the door from both sides, both from the Rishus HaRabim side and from the Gina side. Ein lahen lo lakan v'lo lakan, asurin kan v'kan. But if there is no fort-like structure on either side of the door, then because you're working with a Carmelis on one side and a Rishus HaRabim on the other side, and the place where the key is resting is a Rishus HaYachid, you do not have permission to lock or unlock the door from either side of the door. You cannot pick up the key bichlal. V'chein chanuyos hapesuchos l'Rishus HaRabim, and the same thing is true with a store that opens up into a Rishus HaRabim. Presumably the chanus has a din of a Carmelis. The Rishus HaRabim is a Rishus HaRabim. Bisman shehaman ol lamata me asara. So then it depends, says the Brisa. When the lock box is lower than 10 tfachim, mevi mafteach me erev Shabbos umenicho bi'iskofa. Then what you are allowed to do is take a key from before Shabbos, place it on the threshold that's in front of the door, and as we'll see, this threshold has the status of a Carmelis, and l'machar poseach v'noel umachziro li'iskofa. And the next day, you're allowed to pick up the key from the iskofa, from the threshold, stick it into the lock, unlock the door, and put the key back on the threshold. Now, why that should be, is we'll see you're going to be working with something that presumably is not a real Rishus HaYachid because it's lower than 10 Tfachim. What exactly it is, we'll see shortly. But when the lockbox is above 10 Tfachim, then you can bring a key from before Shabbos and place it in the lock or on top of the lockbox itself. And the next day you can lock and unlock the door and put it back in its place, according to Reb Meir. V'chachamim omrim af bizman shahaman ol l'mayla me'asar tfachim mevi mafteach me'erev Shabbos u'menicho bi'iskofa l'machar poseach v'no'olo machziro l'mekomo o b'chalon shal gabi ha'pesach. Now, even if the lockbox, they say, is higher than 10 tfachim, we still allow you to bring a key before Shabbos, stick it on the threshold, which is ostensibly a Carmelis, and then on Shabbos, you're allowed to pick up the key from this Carmelis threshold and use it to lock and unlock the door, and then you can put it back in its place, or you can put it in the cubby hole that's above the lockbox, which seemingly has the status of a Rishus HaYachid. Now, im yesh b'chalon arba'a al arba'a asur. However, just to correct myself, that's when the cubby hole is not 4x4, so it's not a Rishus HaYachid. But if it's 4x4 and has a din of a Rishus HaYachid, then you're not allowed to stick the key back into that cubby hole, mipnei shehu kemotzi mirishus l'rishus, because it's as if you're carrying from one Rishus to another. Now we're going to clarify this whole Brisa momentarily. That's the end of the Brisa. Now let's clarify. The first part, which had to do with the Gina to a Rishus HaRabim, seemed to be pretty straightforward. But it got a little bit more complicated when we talked about a door that is between a shop and a Rishus HaRabim. So midikamer v'chein chanuyos michlal debi'iskofas karmelis askinan. It seems like we're dealing with a threshold that is inside a Carmelis domain, or that the threshold itself forms a Carmelis. Okay, now if the threshold itself forms a Carmelis, then we have a problem, because Haiman ol hechidami. What is this lockbox? Id lesbe arba'a mokom peturhu. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. If the lockbox is less than 4x4, then it has the status of a mokom petur, and l'chora, and like Rashi explains, v'chi havi l'mayla me'asara hechi mashvi le'reb meir rishus hayachid v'asar. So that's what the Gemara says. I don't understand. You're telling me that when it's lower than 10 tfachim, it's okay to lift up the key from off of the threshold and to unlock the door. But then Reb Meir says, but if it's higher than 10 tfachim, you're not allowed to. The question is, why not? You're allowed to transfer a key from a Carmelist to a Makom Petur, and if this is higher than 10 Tvachim but less than 4 by 4 in horizontal dimensions, then what's the problem of transferring the key from the threshold to the Makom Petur? The Isbe Arba Bahalema Rabbanan Af Bizman Shahaman Ola Maila Meyud Mevi Mafteach Me'er Shabbos Umenichu Ba'askofa and Lamachar Posech Venol Bo Machzir Liskofa Lachalon Shal Gabi HaPesach? Question mark. And if you're telling me that the lockbox is larger than 4 by 4 in horizontal dimensions, so then I have a problem according to the Chachamim. You're telling me if it's higher than 10 Tvachim, larger than 4 by 4 horizontally, then it has a din of a Rishus HaYachid. So how could the Chachamim advocate that you can take the key from off the threshold, which is a Carmelist, stick it into a Rishus HaYachid, and then afterwards put it back to the threshold or put it back in a cubby above the lockbox? Aren't you dealing with a transferal from Carmelist to Rishus HaYachid, which is Aser Midarabanan? So the Gemara says, that's the question. So the question is really, what we've clarified so far is that the Carmelist, the Iskofa rather, the threshold is a Carmelist. So we're just not sure what this lockbox is, because if this lockbox is less than 4 by 4, in which case it would have a din of a Makom Petur, so why does then Rabbi Meir have a problem that when it's higher than 10 Tvachim, you're not allowed to transfer the key from the threshold to a Makom Petur? Everyone holds that that's okay. And if you're telling me that it's larger than 4 by 4, so that it's a Rishus HaYachid, then by what right do the Chachamim say that you can transfer Lechatchila from the Carmelist to the Rishus HaYachid? So Amar Abaye la'olam de'ein bo arba'a v'yesh bo lachuka lahashlimo l'dalid. So Abaye explains, Uvahaplig, either Rab Meir sarva chokikin lahashlim, Rabbanan sarva ein chokikin lahashlim. The answer is as follows. We had seen before a very strange shita of Rabbi Meir called chokikin lahashlim. Just to remind you of what that was, we learned it in the laws of mezuzah. If I have a solid stone wall, and there's an archway in that stone wall, and the archway does not have the requisite aperture size to require mezuzah, which is 10 tfachim high and 4 tfachim wide, because the archway is built in such a way where the top of the arch closes in so that it's less than 4 tfachim wide on top. Rabbi Meir says that if you have a solid mass that could be carved out with a jackhammer, in theory, to make it 4 tfachim wide on top, and since you started 4 tfachim wide on the bottom, you create that imaginary jackhammer and bore out the corners, and that makes the doorway chayiv in the mitzvah of mezuzah. Okay, that's the principle of chokikin lahashlam according to Rabbi Meir. It's a very nebulous halacha, which I guess would require further analysis. In this scenario as well, we're dealing with a lockbox, which is abutting an indentation, or not an imaginary indentation in the doorway. The doorway's thickness is a couple of tfachim. The lockbox's width or depth is a couple of tfachim. So when you look at it by itself, without saying use your imaginary jackhammer to bore into the door, it's less than 4 tfachim, and therefore it has a din of a makom petur. But if you apply the principle of chokikin lahashlim and use your imaginary jackhammer and bore through the door to create additional width using the width of the door, so then it is actually 4 by 4, and it would have a din of a rishus hayachid. So the machlokas between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim is, do we say chokikin lahashlim? Rabbi Meir says you do, l'chumra, and therefore this lockbox has a din of a rishus hayachid, and that's why Rabbi Meir prohibits you from transferring the key from the threshold, which is a Carmelist, to unlock the door, the lock, which is a rishus hayachid. And the Chachamim say, no, it's a makom petur, and it's perfectly okay. So, and that's the machlokas. Amar Rav Bibi bar Abaye shmami no mehamas nisa tlas. So Rav Bibi bar Abaye says we can adduce from this brisa 3 new halachos. Shmami na chokikin lahashlim. So one is that we see that according to Rav Meir, we do say the principle of chokikin lahashlim to place additional restrictions on halacha upon us. Ushmami na hadarbe Rabbi Meir misharegina. Another thing that we see is that Rabbi Meir retracted from his original psak that you're not allowed to stick out your hand when you're in a Carmelis and the key is in a Rishus HaYachid. Now, how do we know this? Because like Rashi explains, midikashari lamod b'rishus harabim. Midikashari lamod al haiskofa karmelis v'lito mafteach b'manul l'mayla me'asara b'iskofas karmelis ulaholicho derech avira l'manul. Because Rabbi Meir does allow you to take the key, when you put the key on top of the lockbox, which is a Rishus HaYachid, he allows you to remove it off the top of the lockbox to unlock the door. Because you're always working within a Rishus HaYachid. So you see that Reb Meir has no problem, even though I'm standing currently in a Carmelis, I'm still allowed to manipulate an object that's in a Rishus HaYachid to unlock the lock. So you see that Reb Meir is no longer machmir to stick out your hand from a Carmelis into a Rishus HaYachid and manipulate objects in the Rishus HaYachid. That's the second thing that we see. And the third thing that we say is V'shamas mina mid'Rabbanan isa l'Rav Dimi. We also learn.
Watch this.
I didn't know how to close it.
You shouldn't be breaking the position.
I'm sorry.
Okay. It's okay. We also learn that according to the Rabbanan hold of Rav Dimi's halacha. Because what did the Chachamim say in this brisa? They told us that you're not allowed to take the key from the iskof of the threshold, put it into the makom. You can use it to unlock the door, but you cannot take this key afterwards, which is in a makom petur, and stick it into a kabi, which is a rishus hayachid. Now, why is that? L'chorah, that should be permitted because you're transferring from a karmelis to a makom petur, and from a makom petur to rishus hayachid. You're not doing any direct transfer from a karmelis to rishus hayachid. The answer is because Rav Dimi is of the opinion that although you can transfer from a karmelis to a makom petur and back, you cannot use your makom petur as a transfer point to get from one rishus to another. Remember, we had seen that before, but this is a confirmation of that. That the Chiyasa Rav Dimi Amar Rav Yochanan Makom Shein Bo Arba Mutal Levnei Rishus Harabim V'Levnei Rishus Hayachid L'Kasef Olav V'Levad Shelo Yachalifu. That's called that you're not allowed to be machlif. You're not allowed to use the Makom Petur as an exchange point between Rishus Hayachid to Rishus Harabim to get stuff from Rishus Hayachid to Rishus Harabim. You can put stuff on it from Rishus Hayachid and then pull it off back into the Rishus Hayachid, but you can't put stuff from Rishus Hayachid on it and then move it over to Rishus Harabim. Let's quickly do the next Mishnah. Nagar sheyesh barosho glustera. That if you have a nagar, now a nagar I would describe as some kind of little iron bar, and they use these little iron bars. I have it in my house today. You stick it in a groove in the sliding door in order to act as a lock. What they used to do is that you would have a door that would open out, let's say, into your domain. From the outside it would open in. So what you would do is you would stick, if you wanted to lock the door, you'd stick that peg in the floor, in a hole in the floor in front of your door, and that would prevent the door from being able to be opened. It's basically a rudimentary lock. That's a little iron bar that gets stuck in a hole in the ground. If the top of the bar has a knob called a glustera, which indicates that it can be used as a kli, so then Rabbi Eliezer oser v'Rabbi Yossi matir. Rabbi Eliezer says it's still prohibited because he views this as an act of boina, as a type of construction every time you stick it into the hole. And Rabbi Yossi says it's mutter. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Maisa b'Knesset b'Shibit Tveria. There was once a synagogue in Tveria, Shahinoagin boheter at Shabbat Rabban Gamliel v'Hasakenim v'Asru lahen. That they thought that this was mutter, but later on, Rabban Gamliel and the other elders told him that what you're doing is usher. So you see that I'm right, that even though it has a knob and it's a kli, it's still usher to do it. But Rabbi Yossi Omer Isser Nagu Babaru Gamliel v'Hasakenim v'Itiru lahen. But Rabbi Yossi says you got the story wrong. The story is not that they permitted it until the rabbis prohibited it, but rather they were machmir and did not permit it until the rabbis came along and told them that it was okay to do it. So you got to get your facts right. We'll just do another 3 lines and we'll be done. The Gemara says, "Benitel ba'agdo kuliyamo lo pligi." Everyone agrees that if this little iron bar is connected with a strong, sturdy rope to the rest of the door structure, then everyone agrees that it's okay, because there it's clearly indicated that this is part of the door, so by sticking the bar into the hole, no one, even Rabbi Eliezer, agrees you're not doing an act of boina on Shabbos. Ki pligi b'she'eno nitel be'igdo. The machlokus is that when it's not connected with a strong rope, either it's not connected at all, or it's connected by a very flimsy string, in which case you can just pull it and it'll snap off. So Demar Savar Kevin Deyesh Barosho Gluster Atoras Kli Alav, that Rabbi Yossi says that since it has a knob on it, it's clearly indicated by its appearance that it's meant as a lock, and therefore it's not bona when you put it into the hole. Omar Savar Kevin Deno Nitol Beigdolo, and the other opinion is that no, since it's not attached properly to the door structure, it's not clearly indicated that it's part of the door apparatus, and therefore you'd be doing an act of bona every time you stick it in.